Hi, everyone. This is Sam Collins, the coding and billing expert for chiropractic, ChiroSecure, and HJ Ross, but most importantly, you. One of the issues I get asked to me all the time, we do seminars, I consult offices, they're always asking, hey, what's going on with the PPO rates? I've been part of ASH, I've been part of Optum, all these plans, and I've never gotten a raise. Is there anything that I can do to get a rate increase? Well, let's talk about that because certainly that can be pretty stagnant and be a practice killer if you're getting paid the same rates for a long time. So let's go to the slides. Let me give you a little primer on what to do because there is something you should be doing to help increase PPO rates. The first thing you have to do is kind of create a value proposition, if you will. You got to start to really look at how do I present my office in a way that they will start to understand the value of my services and can compensate us in that way. So I want you to write a unique value proposition that makes your practice stand out, not just because I've been in it a long time and you've got to increase my rates, cost of living, though that should be part of it. That's not going to be the only thing. Let's remember the insurance company kind of has the upper hand on us because they might say to you, well, look, we already have 25 providers. If you want to drop out, no big deal. We want to show that we have a unique value within the plan. What I would first look at is what is your tier status? Like, by example, if you're with ASH, are you a tier 6? That certainly gives you more leverage because you're considered one of their upper level providers, one that they don't have to monitor, one that is doing the right thing. So certainly that's something to point out is your status within that plan. How long have you been there? Your status been rising, particularly tier 6. I want you to look at also, though, writing up how many visit average you do. And this is something to look at. If you're a tier 6 or a high level, they're expecting that you're a provider that does not overutilize. You're not doing things that cause the practices to stand out, meaning treating everyone 50 visits, if you will. So you're showing, hey, I've got an average number that's reasonable. What is that number? Typically around 8. Now, keep in mind when I say thinking, oh my God, Sam, 8. Well, bear in mind, you're going to have some patients you will see 20 times. They've got a problem that does require it. However, that balances with patients that also need just 1 or 2 visits. So therefore, the average comes in there. And of course, a little bit based on diagnosis, but show that you get the protocol. The whole idea here is to give the patients the best value care, not overutilization or maintenance. And always consider what are the number of providers in the region. If you're in a very saturated area, obviously this doesn't help much, but you might point out your status in the area for the patients that come to you. But certainly, if you're in a more rural or an area that is somewhat underserved, that is going to help. And then I want you to also start to think of what are they paying and how does this work with existing contracts? I want you to look at some existing contracts to show them, hey, you're really undervaluing. By example, many chiropractors who are with American Specialty Health are getting paid the same rates they've been paid since the 90s, simply because they've just never raised them. And if you think of it, that rate of $26 is not even Medicare rates. So when you have a PPO that is below Medicare, I think to myself, give me a break. Medicare is that mandated fee, which is definitely low and should not be anywhere near a reasonable fee, but it's considered kind of that mandate. So I would use that. I would also use workers' compensation for that matter. Workers' comp in some states can be quite high. In Texas, that rate is almost double Medicare. In other states, probably 150%. And so you want to start to use that to show that in order for a practice to be viable, it has to be make a profit. We're not saying we need to gouge anyone, but we certainly have to be able to say if it cost us $30 to treat a patient, we can't make $30 on the visit and remain open. So you want to bring in when you're writing this letter to them, if you will, in this proposal, all of these factors. And of course, inflation. I mean, let's face it, every year inflation has gone up. Everyone who works for the insurance company, I'm pretty sure, has gotten a raise over time. When's the raises for the doctors? And remember, your cost of practice over time has certainly increased. So we want to kind of use these 6 things to kind of set yourself up to make a request. This request is going to be in writing, send it to provider relations, and you want to make sure to put out your unique value proposition, meaning your value within the community, the number of patients. I would certainly love for you to add in there any type of testimonial or information from a patient about how you were able to help them. Not overdoing that, but doing a few certainly would be helpful because obviously an insurance company is there to satisfy their insureds. And if you're a provider that does that, obviously you're a more valued provider. So one of the ways I would frame this is starting to think of it in a way of how would I frame a letter? So here's kind of a suggestion. You might point out, I've been a panel provider since 1999. Some of you are going to have been that long. And you're going to point out, I support the development of managed care in chiropractic because I think it helps do standardized documentation, promote evidence based care, and greater accessibility. We do realize we have to partner with that. And I get that. We do want to help to standardize to make sure that everyone's getting good care and getting the results that are expected. I'm all in. My concern is, in doing that, why are we getting paid the same amount of money for these number of years when there's all the cost increases? So we're showing we're a partner. We get it. Like, by example, I don't think a lot of the managed care plans are necessarily evil, as some of us like to think. The only thing I think that's wrong with them, they just simply don't pay enough to sustain a practice. That's really the case. Now, would I love for them to pay, hundreds of dollars a visit? Well, of course. But let's be reasonable. Should they be paying a fair fee per visit? Certainly, $26 is not going to cut it. And you'll then point out there's been no significant change in the reimbursement from your plan. And I've been a member for decades or 10 years, whatever it is. These days, you have increased staff salaries, increased rent. We have to do multiple computers, electronic records. I mean, look at some of these places are requiring electronic billing. You have to do the internet connections, software contracts, multiple consultants to keep that because you have to maintain security. Think of the increased cost just from that, not to mention cost of living. You'll point out my overhead is nearly 4 times what it was when I enrolled with you. My average cost of seeing a patient is approximately 41 a visit. Imagine if your practice is costing 41 a visit when you count all your overhead. Think about it. What is that overhead? Your rent, phone, internet, staff, everything that runs the practice, cleaning service, all of that. If you're getting 41, well, wait a minute. If that's the cost and the reimbursement is 26 to 40, and that includes copayment, that's business suicide. Can you imagine? Oh, sure, I'm going to have a business that's costing me $41 a service and I'm getting paid $40. How long do you think you're going to stay open? Well, not long. So you're going to point out this level of reimbursement is not a sustainable model. And while being on the plan may create a greater volume of patients, there's a limitation to services that can be delivered in a day, which makes it a moot point. I mean, let's face it, you can always think of, oh, good, I've got an increase in patients, but how many people can you see per hour? At some point, that's finite. Therefore, that really doesn't matter. There's got to be some sort of increase. You'll point out, I note the rates for your insurance plan have increased to allow the plan to remain solvent and provide services that are reasonable. Like everything, do they not make raises on these insurance premiums every year? Now, if you think of it, why do they state that? Oh, because of the increased cost of healthcare. Okay, I'll go with that, except here's what I would point out. For chiropractic, has there been an increase in the result of healthcare? If they're paying us the same rate for the last 10 years, explain to me where the increase in rate is coming from. Now, if you want to talk drug usage or medical services, maybe that's different. And I will tell you, not even medical providers are getting paid more. Maybe it's the drugs, that part I'll give them. But what does that have to do with us? If your rates have come up, it's not because of the providers. It says here, providers are not part of the increased overhead due to the flat allowances that providers have had for over many years. It's unreasonable to assume providers must bear the increased costs with no consideration while the plan has increased their premiums and adjustments and pay to the employees of the plan. Everyone who works for the plan gets 2 to 3% a year. Where are we supposed to go? I mean, at some point, if you're getting paid the same thing, just looking at the cost of gas to go back and forth to work today is going to be unsustainable. And further, you'll point out, in my observation, providers of healthcare services are a cornerstone of the business and have been left out. I'm requesting you increase my per diem reimbursement be raised by a set number of dollars or percentage. This will allow me to continue to welcome these patients to my office for now and the future. Without an increase, it will require that I no longer may sustain this relationship as it is a sum negative, as would be the same for you if your costs were greater. We're trying to just point some logic here. And while I'm not expecting they're going to double our rates, would it be unreasonable to think a 10, 20% if you haven't had a raise in a while? And frankly, I wonder, why are we not getting 3 to 5% a year? And if not, maybe we don't want to be part of this. And this to me also brings up the greater solution to this, which is you're not going to maintain relationships that are non-sustainable. Don't be afraid to drop out of these plans. It's often interesting to me when providers have dropped out that they wind up going, it worked out better. I had an example last week, and this is not an exaggeration. I had an office that indicated he dropped out of a certain plan. He goes, Sam, immediately I lost 30% of my patient volume. He goes, what was funny though, it only equaled 6% of the revenue. So he realized that was a lot of work for nothing. He goes, over time, my practice transitioned and grew because I de-emphasized that. Often think, what if I'm doing and getting appointments for patients that pay below my cost, and that appointment visit is not available to someone who will pay higher, even my cash rate? Let's face it, if I've got an insurance that's not really paying my cash rate, is that really reasonable? Because if you think of it, your cash rate is often your lowest rate possible. And while I'll forgive a little bit for maybe an increased volume, at some point, increased volume is not going to do the trick. Don't be afraid to really look long and hard with these PPOs. Do request an increase. And if they refuse, maybe that's when it's time for us to break that relationship. As always, HJ Ross is your partner, as is ChiroSecure. Seek out help with us. I can help you write a letter like this. We can help you make that value proposition. I really wish you well, my friends. Best wishes. Hi, everyone. It's Sam Collins, the coding billing expert for ChiroSecure and Chiropractic, with another episode. I've been watching a lot of podcasts lately, and I realize people spend way too much time on the intros. So let's talk what we're going to do today. We're going to talk about time documentation for chiropractic. How do we make sure that we've got the right information in the file so there's no loss of revenue? Let's go to the slides. All right, so for time documentation, I'm sure you're all familiar with time documentation has a 15-minute protocol. People often say, what does a 15-minute mean? Is it full 15? Not quite. Let's get into it. However, before we get there, let's talk about what's going on with chiropractic and documentation, period. Now, as some of you may know, I'm part of the Optum Health Coding and Reimbursement Committee. And one of the things we do in some of our meetings is to talk about where chiropractic audits are happening, what's they're looking for, and what's the issue. Here's something that goes back a couple of years, but it's the latest information we have. I'm expecting some new information coming up shortly, but nonetheless, it shows that for chiropractors, we have a 28% failure rate of our documentation not supporting our services. Now, before we get all, oh my God, 20% is not very good, please notice PTs, about 38%. So it shows that we got to do a better job still, but we're not the only ones. In fact, sometimes say chiropractors are the worst. Not true at all. Let's look at where we fail, though. If you go back some 10 years ago, you can see some of it was illegible documentation, things of that nature, and really bad, 64% on some things. But look at where we've changed. Notice illegible documentation is pretty much nil. And I think mostly because of electronic health records, thankfully. But notice the area of timed PMR. PMR stands for physical medicine rehabilitation. So your PT services, if you will, those are the ones that have 15 minutes. And of course, notice we had a very high level of almost 70%, whereas now it's about 22%. That's still really high. So how is it that 8 out of 10 times we're okay, but there's the 2 out of 10 we're not? What's going on? What are we not understanding when it comes to time documentation? As you're familiar with, the physical medicine codes do have time. Here's a list of the common ones, but I want to focus in on timed services. So you notice here under therapeutic procedures, by the way, this would also go for the attended modalities like ultrasound, but I'm going to leave it here where it says physician or therapist, meaning the chiropractor, required to have direct one-on-one contact with the patient. This means being in the room. It doesn't necessarily mean touching, but being in the room. So you notice here it says therapeutic procedure, one or more areas, and then I put the star around the 15 minutes. So we're all familiar with, of course, yes, it's 15 minutes. So we have to spend time in order for this to happen. So what's happening here is we're not documenting it. And I've seen lots of ways doctors have documented time. That's just not going to work. And I'm hoping today to give you a short primer on saying, what do I actually have to write down? What needs to be in the file to do this? And by the way, I don't care if you're doing cash or insurance. It doesn't matter. Proper documentation is important for any aspect. So let's talk about this time, the 15 minutes. What does the time actually include? And I think this is where a lot of people miss out. By example, there's some time you do that's beforehand. So notice it says pre-service time, assessment and management. Now, some of that maybe have done with your adjustment, but let's face it, when you're going to do an ultrasound, is it the time that the ultrasound is on, or is there some pre-work you have to do for that? Of course, there is. So long as you're making contact for the ultrasound service directly, that time would count. Then there's, of course, the intra-service time. That includes doing the service, obviously. But then notice post-service includes assessment of treatment effectiveness, taking a look at the area, making sure how the patient's feeling, realizing all of that is a component that's part of it. Now, once you move on to another service, no. But I want to highlight it's not just physically, okay, start, stop. Think of it in many ways. Have you ever had an hour massage and have gotten a full hour of massage, or is it around 50, 55 minutes? Because there's some work in between that the person's doing, of course. So this comes from what we call the 8-minute rule. And you'll see here it says unit number of minutes, and it talks about that the time of a 15-minute code actually does not need to be 15 minutes. For one unit, so long as you spend at least 8 minutes of time, you may bill a unit. So it's more than 50%. Now, where it gets tricky, that's easy enough. A lot of people wonder, good, so if I do one service at 8 minutes, if I do another service at 8 minutes, would that count as a unit? The answer to that would be no, because time is cumulative. Because notice, one unit can be 8 minutes, but as much as 22. The second unit doesn't begin until 8 minutes into the next unit, hence why it's 23, 15 plus 8. So in order to bill 2 units, it has to be 23 minutes or 8 minutes into the second one. Or notice for 3 units, 8 minutes into the third, or 38. So let's make sure when you're documenting time services, you document how much time you're spending. The face-to-face time, that's a component of that service. That includes a little pre, intra, and post. Now, let's be careful. Don't tell me it took 10 minutes pre-service, but at the same token, 2 to 3 minutes would be probably pretty reasonable. So document that entire time. I think the difficulty is how do we make sure to document the time itself? Let me get one more factor out here, though. When we talk about time-based services, here at the bottom it says only one time-based service may be reported at a time, and it means that services are cumulative. So if I do 10 minutes of, say, exercise, and then 10 minutes of massage, just to say 2 services, what's my total time? 10 plus 10 is 20 minutes. Does that equal 2 units? You can see here, no, Sam, if I'm only doing 20 minutes, that's 1 unit. So can I not bill both? No, you cannot bill both. Now, the good news is you can bill one of them, and it's the one that's the more expensive of the 2, certainly one with higher RVU, but not both. But keep in mind, what if you did 11 minutes plus 12 minutes for a total of 23? Would that be appropriate to bill? The answer would be yes, it would be. So again, just make sure we're documenting time. I think where we run into problems is what is acceptable. How do we document time? And I want to give you the definitive. This comes from the American Medical Association, American Physical Therapy Association, and adopted by the American Chiropractic Association. You can disagree with all these groups, but I'll tell you, frankly, I don't care, because that's the rule. Whether you agree or disagree with the speed limit doesn't change the speed limit. So let's understand this is what we need to do. And if we disagree with it, I'd say let's work on making some changes. But until then, this is what we have to follow. So notice it gives 2 methods that are accepted. It says a specific number of minutes. So if you tell me, hey, I spent 15 minutes, 18 minutes, 22 minutes, perfectly acceptable. What you want to say is, I did 15 minutes of manual therapy, including deep tissues or soft tissue mobilization to the shoulder in deltoid and, let's say, infraspinatus. I don't know, I'm throwing out muscles. And I spent 15 minutes. Would that be adequate? Absolutely. Tell me the time, tell me the where. Or you can list from and to time. Now, notice there's 2 options. You either put the exact number of minutes, or you put from and to time. 9:30 to 9:45, by example. Now, some people wonder, is one better than the other? Technically, no. However, I've noticed a few carriers, particularly Anthem, appear to say they prefer from and to time. So if that's what someone prefers and that's what's going to be the easiest path, why not just get in the habit of that? So when I'm teaching at chiropractic colleges now, I am telling them just put from and to. Simpler. Now, technically you can do either, but why not have both? And here's what I'll take away from it. Have you ever had what I call the 10-minute rule? When you go meet someone, they say, hey man, meet me someplace. Oh yeah, it takes like 10 minutes. Do you ever notice it never takes 10 minutes? It's always like 20 because it's 10 minutes when things are perfect. There's no rain, there's no traffic or whatever the case may be. So I would prefer to say, how much time did I actually spend? Because often when I think we put 10 minutes, did we really mean 10 or was it 12 or 13? So I think from and to time certainly works better. However, either one works, and you can certainly defend it on either because that's written in the guideline. However, notice what is unacceptable. Documenting time in terms of units. Remember the old days, chiropractors said, I did 2 units. That's not going to work. Or how about this one? Saying a range. This one to me is funny, like saying I spent from 6 to 12 minutes. Huh? How could you spend from, you either spent 6 or 7 or 8 and so on. So no ranges. You obviously can't just say, hey, I did exercise times 2. What do you mean 2 exercises? So it has to be time. And then you can't simply circle. Remember the old forms we used to get from Parker? You could circle, I did exercise, I did this. If you're going to do a billing for your billing person to look at it and just code, but the documentation, really that's not acceptable. And to give you further light of that, look at what United Healthcare has just published. For any time-based procedure, the duration of services must be clearly documented in the medical record. If the duration of time-based services is not clearly and properly documented in the record, the service is not supported due to incomplete documentation. This is where I've run into tons of denials. I work a lot with chiropractic in general, whether it's malpractice carriers like ChiroSecure and others. But dealing with attorneys in courts and with testimony, the one area that I can always defend you is if you put time. But if you don't put time down, it's going to be a problem. So you've got to make sure time is listed. But notice they say if more than one procedure is in that time, in order to fully support all the services, the time must be separately documented for each, and it must match. But notice it gives 5 things. And notice I just did the one through AMA, AACA, and so forth. You can't say documentation of time-based codes. You can't say units. You can't say a range. You have to do in quantity, but not specifying measurement or increment, and in no time mention all. So give me time. Is that very hard? No. You know what I think happens? We're used to being quicker and easier. We all wanted that. I want to be able to document in 5 minutes or 2 minutes. And that's not going to happen. Certainly it shouldn't take 10 minutes. But realize, do you know documenting the service counts towards it as long as you're doing it with the room of the patient? So you know you're finishing it up, that last note, that certainly could count towards that time if it's part of that service. What I want from you, just document time. Don't let it be an issue. If you've done 2 units, I want to see at least 22 minutes. And as much as 37. So keep in mind, keep your time there. If you do, you'll never have a problem. We want to make sure you're getting paid. The H.J. Ross Company, the network, me specifically, that's my job. If you want to have some one-on-one help where we can work one-on-one, ask me direct questions, deal with issues that come up in your office, not just some fantasy about someone else, do that. We offer a service called the network, and we want to be here to help. I'll say to everyone, go out and be well, have a very good day, and see you next time. Hi, everyone. It's Sam Collins, the coding and billing expert for chiropractic, the H.J. Ross Company, ChiroSecure, and of course, you. We're always dealing with issues, changes, things going on. Obviously, 2024 is coming. There's going to be RVU updates and other things. But one of the things we have to deal with, and this has come up quite a bit recently as an expert, lots of questions related to this. I'm getting denials or I'm having problems with my evaluation and management codes. I want to make sure I'm getting paid. And this is even for the seasoned doctor because there's some things going on we want to start to address. So let's go to the slides. Let's talk about evaluation and management, or E&M codes, and specifically for chiropractic coding and payment. What do we need to do? What's going on with E&Ms, our exams? Obviously, the first thing I've been running into is sometimes we'll get denials where they'll come back and say, the examination was not within scope or not covered. Let's first talk about that. Would it be reasonable for a doctor of chiropractic to treat someone without examining? It's a requirement to determine what's wrong. Can you imagine? Patient just comes in and you say, I don't care what's wrong, lay down and let's adjust you. Obviously, there's legal and ethical requirements to do so to evaluate a person. So there is a requirement. So whenever you get a pushback on something like that, unless you have a contract that says otherwise, and this is where you do have to be careful. What if you join something that says we're bundling everything in? By example, if you belong to United Healthcare under Optum Health, they're going to bundle the exam into the treatment, meaning you're going to get $60 a visit, regardless of an exam, x-rays, or otherwise. I'm talking outside of that. There otherwise, of course, is a requirement for an exam, and it should be payable unless it's contracted otherwise. However, something we have to consider is, are we using the right codes? Remember, the codes are updated, and in fact, they're changing a little bit for 2024. May want to get to a seminar with me to get that. But nonetheless, we're going to have new patient codes, 99202 to 205, and established patients codes, 99211 to 215. Remember, these codes have two components for use. Are you choosing the code based upon severity, medical decision making, something simple like a 202, or something very highly complex, maybe life-threatening with a 205, or someplace in between? The key factor is it's going to be one of these. And when you use this code, what you are indicating is that you're doing an exam. And this is one that's going to be above and beyond what you do on a day-to-day basis. And that's the big reason for why you have to use modifier 25. And this is the issue I see time and time again. I'll get someone to contact me and say, hey, Sam, I got denied for an exam. And I'll say, okay, let's talk about that. Did you bill with a modifier 25? And particularly for a new doctor, they often say, what do you mean by modifier 25? Let's remember, modifier 25 is a requirement when billing an exam with treatment to be put on the exam to demonstrate that this exam is above and beyond what they call the pre, intra, and post-service evaluation. If you don't put that modifier, it's an automatic denial. You're basically stating to the insurance, don't pay me. Let's make sure we're putting on there, pay me. And that's what the 25 does. Remember, the 25 does not change the price. It just indicates it's a separate and distinct evaluation. Let's get into that a little bit. When you treat someone on a day-to-day basis, let's say it's the second visit, you're probably going to, on the second visit, ask them, hey, how are you feeling today? Is that a little better, a little worse? Maybe do some objective evaluation, leg check, palpation, range of motion. That part of an evaluation is embedded into the treatment or the manipulation code. So for that reason, we have to demonstrate to the carrier that the exam is above and beyond that. That's the reason for the 25. It's the sole reason you don't bill an evaluation every day. Why don't you? You do one every day, but remember, there's a small portion of it that's embedded. So what you're doing with the 25 is saying, no, this is above and beyond. So realize the first visit, a lot of information is going on, history and exam and so forth. On the follow-up visit the next time, not so much. You're just doing a review. However, after 30 days, would it be appropriate to do an exam again? Sure. What we have to assure, though, is does the exam correlate to something above and beyond the day-to-day visit? And that's going to be important because putting the 25 is what's going to show to be paid. Here's an example. Notice this is a patient getting an adjustment, massage, therapeutic activities, but notice 25 is on the exam code to demonstrate that it's separate and distinct. Again, not a change in price, simply showing it's separate and distinct. So be mindful. The number one reason exams are denied is lack of the modifier. The other factor, though, could be, did we demonstrate that it was separate? Now, sometimes people get confused and say, does it require it? So I want to show you, this is a picture. This is from the 2024 CPT manual. And I'm going to highlight here, it says the chiropractic manipulative treatment codes includes a pre-manipulation patient assessment. Additional evaluation management services, including office or outpatient visits, and it names all of them, including home visits. It says may be reported, and I'll go right here, may be reported separately using modifier 25. If the patient's condition requires a significant, separately identifiable E&M service above and beyond the usual pre-service and post-service work associated with the procedure. So you can see here, even in the manual, so if you ever get a pushback saying, oh, it's included, you're going to point out, that's the reason I put the 25, because it's separate and distinct and above and beyond. It isn't what you do day to day. The day-to-day eval I get, but the one you do after 30 days certainly is beyond that. Remember, when you do a re-exam, it must be a re-exam. Make it appear so. Right on that date, re-examination. Go through all the details. It's not the simple day-to-day one. When you have that in place, now we have a place to defend. I had an office defend say, I did do a re-exam. It was after 30 days. But if you looked at the notes, unfortunately, the evaluation that day was no different than what they did the visit before. So make sure when you do a reevaluation, you can defend that it was above and beyond, significantly separate. It's appropriate every 30 days, no question. That's under CMS rules and adopted by most carriers. Can it be sooner? Yeah. What if a patient comes in today, neck pain, and then after a few treatments, they come in and go, oh my goodness, I fell down and I hurt my low back last night. Would it be appropriate to do an exam to their lower back? Absolutely. Now, what is it going to be, a very high level one? Probably not. They're an established patient, but it would be appropriate, even though it's sooner than 30 days. But what do we have to demonstrate? It was significant, separately identifiable above and beyond what we do day to day. So I'm always going to say push back on this. If they're telling you it's inclusive, send a copy of your exam. Point out, this is page 871 of the CPT manual, by the way, for the 2024 edition, that shows clearly, according to the guidelines, it is. Just be careful. Don't bill an exam just because it's 30 days, but because it's separate, distinct, and above and beyond, the reason for the 25. Don't be caught in the trap of thinking you're just going to bill one because, but significant and separate, and of course, the use of the modifier. As always, ChiroSecure, H.J. Ross, myself, we want to make sure you're doing good work and getting paid for it. Are you always up to date? Realize we're keeping you up to date always as a network member. I give you one-on-one help where we can dig in. I've got letters that deal with this that you can adjust a little bit for your situation, but ultimately defend why you're doing it, highlighting the rules and the regulations. Your goal, do good care for your patient. My goal, make sure you're getting paid for it. Get to a seminar, come to a network service with us. We'll be there to help. Thank you, and see you next time, everybody. Wishing you the best. Hello, everyone, and greetings for the new year. This is Sam Collins, your coding and billing expert for chiropractic, including ChiroSecure and the H.J. Ross Company. We want to talk this year and start the year talking about what's going on with fees. Do I raise? How do I raise? Let's start to get some understanding of 2024 fee schedules, what we need to do to make sure our practice continues to succeed. And of course, that means success is partly got to be revenue. And I know sometimes you think, well, I can't talk about money. You better, because you are a business. So let's go to the slides. Let's talk about fee updates and changes for 2024 for the chiropractic profession. One thing to keep in mind is that fee schedules do update and change. Some years not as much as we like or at all, but we got to think of, how do I update? Should I update? When do I update? I think we start with, how are your fees valued? What really determines the value of one service to the other? It's kind of community and the patient, but ultimately, you want to start to think of who is setting these fees. The first person is you. What do you feel the service is worth? I'm not going to certainly say I'm letting an insurance company dictate this is what it's worth. There are offices who charge much more than what some insurances allow. Think of it. For those of you that belong to ASH, I bet your cash rate for your treatment is higher than that. Now, what's the trade-off is they're saying, we'll send you more people, but we'll pay you less money. So setting the fees comes down to you, but also who you belong to. There's also something called the relative value units, or RVUs. If you've attended a seminar with me, you've seen this, and it's updated for this year. You want to start to understand, how is it overseen? Every single CPT code, every single one, has a relative value. So if you could tell me the price of one service based on what that insurance pays for that one service, I can give you an idea or the amount that they will allow based on the relative value from another service. All these are simply comparisons of one service to another. This is set up and has been done by the federal government since the 80s. And what they do is they break down each and every code and base the relative value on several factors. The cost of the service generically, but also the cost of the provider of service, the cost of living adjustments that happen for your cost to run the office, cost of education, cost of supplies, a little bit of all that's put in there. And that's why these vary year to year. Don't think that if you have one from 5 years ago, it's the same today. In addition, though, of course, who's going to set those fees? Your contracts. If you belong to an HMO or a PPO, they're pretty much going to tell you this is what we allow, like maybe ASH, Optum Health, these types. One thing to keep in mind, though, have any of you ever dealt with how to properly get a raise and how to create value so you can? I had an office this year, actually a few, that got as much as a 50% increase from ASH. Why did that happen? They created a value. It's a way of setting yourself up to make sure they see the value, and they value you by increasing your rate to keep you in the system. Keep in mind, though, also what setting fees are deductibles. And it doesn't really set the fee, but it tells you how much is the patient paying before they start. Remember, deductibles often will reset at first of the year, but do keep in mind that's not always the case, because I've always thought it was unfair. What if you got sick in November, December, pay your deductible, you continue going to the doctor, and then in January, your deductible starts all over again. You're like, oh my goodness. There are some things about deductibles that often with most plans, they do this. Services that a person receives in the last quarter of the year, usually October on, may roll over to the next year. So that's certainly something to look at, because obviously, what if someone has a $1,000 deductible, they start in December, will that deductible then be applied when it comes to January? On many plans, no, it may roll over. So that's something to consider, because obviously a patient's going to think, oh my God, I'm just paying all this money out of pocket. So that's going to be a difference. Remember, deductibles do update a little bit. This year for Medicare, it did up to $240. It was $226 last year. It went up $14. It's been pretty consistent many years. Probably 15 years ago, it was $205. So you can see here, you can look and go, has it increased a few percent every year? Actually, it has, about 4 to 5%. If you think cost of living, you're about right. What also is determined, though, is, well, what are going to be the co-pays and co-insurance? Now, let's make sure we understand the difference when it comes to fees. What is a co-payment? A co-payment is the amount a patient pays that's fixed. You belong to this insurance network with them. They have a $10 copay, let's say 20, whatever the case may be. It's fixed. It's always the same. Sometimes that copayment, though, could be a percentage based upon what services you build. But keep in mind, a copayment is always a fixed amount. It's going to be the same. Whereas a coinsurance is when you're not in network. Copay is in network. It's set, fixated. Co-insurance is when you're not in network. And this is something to keep in mind, that I've had some offices get themselves in trouble because what's going on is they're billing out an insurance $300. Let's face it, are there some plans, personal injury and others, they'll pay you $300 a visit? Of course, we love it. Bill it, get paid. But what about a person that you're not in their network? You bill $300 a visit, and that plan only pays you $100. How much does the patient owe? That co-insurance would be $200. If you bill $300, you collect $300, unless you're in network and have a write-off. And there's the difference. Write-offs happen because you're in network, or maybe an occasional hardship. But keep in mind, when it comes to setting fees, let's not let our poor paying insurances set our fee, nor our best. Obviously, will we prefer to get $300 a visit? Sure, but is that reasonable for all plans? What my goal is always thinking of, what would you charge? What would someone patient pay for cash? My insurance fee should be in that range. Yeah, a little above 5 to 15%, but nonetheless above. The one exception, of course, for California providers, there is a provision for out-of-pocket that's different. But for everyone else, 5 to 15%. But do remember, all these things have to come into play. So what's going on with 2024? Is there really some big changes? Not really. Well, let's talk about it. Medicare fees, you'll notice, if you haven't already, if you're in our network, of course, contact me. I'll give you the updates there, of course, with work comp. There's not much of a change. In fact, the change actually was slightly lower. And of course, that's frustrating because Medicare fees already are the lowest. Well, why did they get lower when everything else has cost more? Thank Congress for that. Obviously, there's a lot of things nationally we deal with, from budgets for military to Medicare and all those things. And what's an easy one to cut? Payments to doctors. And so they did. That helps for them to balance the budget, which means you're going to see on the chiropractic end probably from a few pennies to maybe as much as 50 cents. And I've seen some areas as much as $1 per service. So now, is that a big, big change? No. But it's a change nonetheless. Does that mean you should be lowering fees to others? No, I never let Medicare fees necessarily dictate what I charge because, of course, I may be lowering. In fact, if you look at Medicare fees today compared to 3 years ago, they're lower. They really are. Now, not by a ton, but lower. Therefore, I want to look at it from a standpoint of, okay, how do I make sure to use this? Now, particularly if you're in states like Michigan or Florida, there are plans there that simply just use 200% of Medicare and just say, here are the Medicare rates. This is the amount. This is what the patient pays. Bottom line, though, is we're not always in those states. But what about states that do have relative values that they convert? Like, by example, I haven't shown you the relative values yet, but by example, if you're in the state of Texas, for workers' comp, they simply take 64.83 and then multiply by the relative value. If you're in Connecticut, it's $51.50. I believe in Utah, it's $52. So there's a little bit of variation. Keep in mind, for Medicare, it's $33. Now, let's talk about this from the standpoint of the relative value. What they're doing is converting that. It's a fee comparison. If you have a code that's worth 0.75 and another code that says it's worth 1, that simply means that code is worth 25% more. So if I'm billing $75 for a service that's 0.75, when I bill for a service worth 1, what should be the fee? $100. Pretty straightforward. It's that easy when you look at relative values. In fact, you'll see this reflected in fees most often, particularly with work comp, Medicare, and others. And you'll notice if you look at the comparisons of this year compared to last year, you're going to notice, well, Sam, that's pretty flat. The 98940 and 41 stayed exactly the same. But then 4.2 and 4.3 dropped down by 1 percentage point. Does that make a major difference? No. But nonetheless, and it gives you this, I look at this, oh, well, wait a minute. If you'll notice, the fee for 98940 is 0.82 and 1.18. That means it's basically 36% higher. Or to make it simple, just think a third higher. This is why you'll notice, if you have a fee that's $50 for 98940, I can't tell you how often I've seen someone going, oh yeah, my 98940 is 50 and my 98941 is 60. And I go, why? How did you value that? Keep in mind, the average fee for chiropractic manipulation from Medicare is between around $30 for a 4.0. What's the value of 98941? I'm going to say from 40 to 45. Now you may think, oh, that still doesn't seem that much, but keep in mind, let's just take double the Medicare rate. If the Medicare rate is 30, what's double that? 60. So what if your regular fee is 60? Notice when I double the rate of 40 to 45, that means it's 80 to 90. It's about a third higher. The number one area I find for network members, people who attend seminars, is not understanding that simple fact and way undervaluing their service. In other words, if I am billing you $55 for 98941, but I'm willing to pay $70, how much am I going to pay you? $55, what you billed me. So I want you to start to look at, when you're setting a fee, use as a barometer starting at 98940 and look at the relative price for other things. By example, have you ever looked at your difference of when you're billing a 99203, a simple mid-level exam, patient has a couple complaints, a little trauma. The value of that service, a 99203, is roughly 4 times the value of 98940. So I've seen this time and time again. Office charges $50 for a 4.0. Okay, fair, but on the low end, but fair. But yet their price for a 99203 is $90 or $100. I'm going, huh? You have a code that's worth 4 times the amount that you're charging 50% above. How did you come up with that? Most offices, I didn't know. Now, I'm not against you determining the fee the way you want it, but you may want to start to look at the value. Much if you own a house, when you go to sell it, do you just think, hey, I paid XYZ for it, I'm going to charge a little more? Or do you look at the neighborhood and determine, oh my God, the houses are selling for $1.5 million, even though I paid $400,000, I'm going to sell my house for $1.5 million because that's what it's worth. So start to think of, when you're looking at fees for this year, let's look at also the relative prices, but what price increases am I doing? If you're not increasing a % or 2 a year, you're losing. Remember, your cost of living changes every year. Heck, it changes month to month for some of us. If you haven't raised your rates in a while, how are you making more money? Are you just saying the only way my practice can do better is I have to see more people? Nothing wrong with that. But I think for the most part, I found offices that I consult with directly, network members especially, they've undervalued. And you can simply increase your revenue by understanding the actual value of a service. By example, Medicare sets these fees, and who follows them? Everyone, in the sense of the percentages. Some states just use a percentage of Medicare. So start to look there and thinking, oh my God, I've way undervalued. I can't tell you how many times I find that. In fact, I find it 90% of the time. So I want you thinking of, how do I value a service? What is usual and customary for my area? Realize usual and customary is not always what you think, because what if you have people that are undervaluing the service in your area? Does that make it usual and customary? Not really. It just means you've got some people that do it. There's an area in San Diego that's one of the most expensive areas to live in the state, if not to mention the country. Lovely, beautiful area. Do you know the relative value in that area is not any different anyplace else? But I find it has a lower value for usual and customary because there's a lot of quote unquote low cost chiropractors there who charge $25 a visit. So it lowers everyone's prices. It's like the person who doesn't keep their house up, makes the whole neighborhood go down a little bit. Kind of the same idea. So be careful of just comparing your friends. Look at the real value. And remember, what is fair? What would I pay? What is the value of the service they're given? I have some offices that do all cash that charge a lot. Now, it's not for everyone, but do they have people come in? Yeah, because they get a really good service. I've never once picked a doctor because it was cheaper. Now, it's not to say I wouldn't want to be reasonable, but I want to go where I'm getting good care. So you got to think of, am I doing the 99-cent store of chiropractic, or am I doing a good value of service? By the way, there's nothing wrong with the 99-cent store, but how does that work? It's volume. And keep in mind, when it comes to setting a fee, can you have a dual fee? Now, I mentioned California, a little bit different, but every place else, no. Your fee is your fee. Again, can you have a small difference for paid time of service? 5 to 15%, sure. But not anything significant. Keep in mind, where people get confused, could you have multiple fees based on contracts, like your Medicare rate, your work comp rate, your Blue Cross rate? Sure, those are separate because they're contract. Outside of not contracting, remember, the patients pay the difference. So be careful. When you have a person you're not contracted with, and there's a balance due or not paid by the insurance, they have to pay that amount. We cannot simply write it off. That's considered fraud or inducement or giving the patient a gift. We can't give patients gifts. So bottom line is, start to really think of a fee. That's what we do with our services, with the network, with our seminars. If you haven't been familiar, get to the one first of the year. Let's go through all our views. Let's understand how to value it. What is your fee schedule for your state? Many of you go, oh, I don't know. That's what we do to help you. But how do you raise it? What do I do? Some of that's going to be based on patients. Should you inform them rates are going up? Sure. If you tell your patient, I'm raising my rates $20, most will go, wow. But what if you haven't raised your rates in 25 years? Trust me, some chiros haven't. $20 raise is not much. Can you imagine if you said, I'm going to sell my house for the same price I bought it 20 years ago? Would you do that? I bet your house price is at least doubled. So with patients, not to get them thrown off, you should be raising rates slightly every year. If you were to raise your rates $2 a year, after 10 years, it's 20 more. For many of you, that wouldn't be that big a deal. And that's reasonable. People understand costs. If you're not passing on, you're absorbing it. By example, what if you have credit card fees? What have you done to offset that? Obviously, we can't charge extra money percentage, but could you charge a service fee? Something to consider. You also have to consider, though, insurance, not just patients. What do insurances allow? Now, that's not going to be the end-all, be-all, but it's got to come into the equation as to whether or not what is actually being paid or allowed. And this is why some people get out of insurance going, I'm not going to belong to the ASH because it's too low. And I don't disagree with that, because at some point, you can only do so much volume in a day. Yes, I know some chiropractors can see 150 people in a day. Many cannot. So remember, these insurance contracts all help to set up what's going to be fair and reasonable. And I'm not against the contracts. Just be careful of undervaluing what you do. That's what we do. Get to a seminar, join the network, really understand, how do I honestly set a fee? It's one of the things I mandate to network members to do. You should mandate to yourself, how do I change my practice to make sure I'm getting a good, fair fee? Not overcharging, but also not undercharging. I wish you very well for 2024. Set up to have a good intention for what's going to change for you and help your patients at the same time. But your business has to stay open. Your rent didn't decrease, I'm pretty sure. Take care, everyone. Until next time.